This video is looking at the designer study question that you had on your January paper. So these designer study questions are really common. They're always 12 marks at the end of your research methods section. And the mark breakdown is always 6 marks for AO2 and 6 marks for AO3. And so we'll look at why that's important in just a moment. In this case, it's asking you to design an experiment, but of course you may get asked to design an observation, you may get asked to design a study using self-report, any type of research methods, including correlation, you could be asked to design. So it's really important that you make a note of what's required in the dot points. So they will say explicitly what information they want. Sometimes you might be asked to write the hypothesis. Other times you might be asked to explain the sampling procedure. You might be asked to talk about inferential statistics. You might be asked to talk about ethics. Basically, any element of designing a study you could be asked to discuss. So this is why it's so important that you actually pay attention to what they're asking for in this particular designer study question. Okay, so let's break this down. So in your answer, you should provide details of the aim of the experiment, identification and manipulation of the variables. So this is our IV and our DV. Controls to minimize the effects of extraneous variables. And so we need to look at what extraneous variables might be present and how we're going to help to control and minimize them. And then finally, data handling and analysis. And they've specifically said descriptive statistics and/or data presentation. So many of you in your response here spoke about inferential testing and started naming inferential stats. That's not what was needed here. So if you're asked about descriptive statistics, we're talking about measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion. So mean, median, and mode, range, and standard deviation. Data presentation is asking you what graph you would show. How would you present your data in some sort of graphical form? So for this question, let's break it down. Let's have a look at what we would do here. Actually, before we do that, let's have a look at what this actually means. AO2 and AO3 are both absolutely necessary. AO2 is asking you how you would implement these design decisions. How are you actually going to do this? If you're going to use random sampling, how? If you're going to present your data in a bar chart, how are you going to do that? What are your bars going to be and what are your labels on your axes going to be? Then the AO3 is asking you to justify. Why? If you're presenting it as a bar chart, why? If you're using random sampling, why? So you must ensure that not only are you explaining the process for every decision that you make, but you need to justify those choices as well. It doesn't matter if your choices aren't perfect. You know, we all know that every design decision comes with its consequences and limitations. You don't need to justify that. You only need to say why you have chosen to use that particular technique. You're not going to get marks then for necessarily saying all the issues that might come with it. So let's start looking at this question. Let's start with the structure. I would suggest using subheadings and dot points. That way you can ensure that you're just sticking to the dot points that they've suggested in the question. So, the aim. Okay, so in this study, the aim is to look at the effect, to investigate the effect of independent and group tasks on happiness. It's simple, it's succinct, it's got our IV and our DV, but our aim is not operationalized. Just keep it very, very simple. Okay, so what I would be doing at this point is ticking this off. Yes, good, fantastic, I've included the aim of the experiment. The next is our variables. I'll be making another subheading here for our second dot point. Our variables, our IV, our DV, and of course we want to operationalize both. So our IV, we need to include our levels, e.g. our control condition and our experimental conditions. and we need to justify this choice as well. So why is there a control condition? Why is there one experimental, or why is there two experimental conditions? Our dependent variable, we need to be precise about the measurement. How exactly are you going to, in this case, measure happiness? For example, level of happiness on a scale of 1 to 10 on the Henry Happiness Inventory. Okay, you can just make up a name, that's fine. So our variables, we need to be very, very clear how we're going to operationalize these. Great, so I've identified and manipulated the variables, and now I need to include details of the task. So I actually need to do a little bit of work here on explaining what the method is going to be. So I might put task description and then explain how long the experiment's going to run for, exactly what participants are going to be required to do, exactly what that task is going to be, and yeah, just outline all the details of the experiment. The more detail, really, the better. And then I'll be able to give myself a tick here as well. How to minimize and control for the extraneous variables. This is where you need to really show off your research method's key terms. This is where I want to be seeing things like random allocation, standardization, randomization, situational variables, participant variables, demand characteristics, investigator effects. This is where you can really show off all of those buzzwords that you know. So you need to explain in the context of this study what extraneous variables may be present. You don't need to go to town on this. You know, if you identified two extraneous variables and explained how they were happening and explained how are you going to control for them, then that would be fine for you to get your tick for this one here. So I'd urge you to read the model answer for this one to have a look at the extraneous variables I've chosen to discuss. Note that this question is asking about an independent group's design. Many of you chose to try and control for participant variables, which is great. In an independent group's design, we try and control for participant variables by using random allocation. So then you'd outline how. You'd go about randomly allocating participants, and then you'd say why and justify that. Unfortunately, many of you at this point, in order to control participant variables, just changed it to a matched pairs design. And unfortunately, that meant that you couldn't get any marks for this third dot point because your suggestion was inappropriate. So be very, very careful. Make sure that you're closely reading that question. And then finally, our final subheading is going to be data analysis. And our descriptive statistics. So we're going to say what, for example, our median. We're going to say how we're going to do that. So how would you calculate the median for this data set? And then why. Why have you chosen the median? Because we're dealing with ordinal data. And so therefore the mean would not be appropriate and the mode would not be sensitive enough. So we need to justify all of our decisions. Likewise, we could do the same for a bar chart because we're dealing with discrete data. We're dealing with two different groups, those that completed the task independently versus those who did it as a group. And therefore, this would be best presented in a bar chart with the discrete variables being the two bars. And so then we can explain how we would do that, what it would look like. You might want to draw a little sketch, and then more importantly, why. So I just want to really, really emphasize this: justify your choices. Without any justification, you can't get any more than 6 marks if you designed a perfect study, because you haven't actually evaluated your design. So let's have a look at the bands for this question. In order to get more than 10 or more marks in level 4, you must address all 4 elements. If you didn't get to the last dot point, then unfortunately you've maxed out at 9. Likewise, if you want to get into that third level there, you have to address at least 3 of those elements. Most of you, unfortunately, fell somewhere here between 4 to 6 marks, and it was because your suggestions were inadequate. That was if you used a matched pairs design rather than an independent groups design. And unfortunately, some of you made a further error in that you described inferential statistics rather than descriptive statistics. And so it meant that you were somewhere between these 2 levels. And so unfortunately, marks of 4 out of 12 were not uncommon on this paper. So my words of advice for you here. Make sure that you are writing about all 4 of those dot points so that you're not immediately disbarred from getting in the higher mark bands. Make sure that you are using subheadings so that you're in control of your response and you're not writing unnecessary things that won't get you any marks. And so you can tick it off as you go. And what I would always do the whole way is say what you are doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it. What am I doing? I'm going to randomly allocate participants. How am I going to do that? I'm going to put all of the numbers in a hat, and etc., etc. Why am I doing this? Because in this study, if you had all of the social people choose to go and do the group task, that's going to increase their levels of happiness, which is going to create an unintended extraneous variable in this research looking at the effects of independent or group tasks on happiness. So we're not just giving a generic why because it reduces participant variables, we're saying in context why this is important for this study. So here is the mark scheme, which you've got access to, and you've also got a model answer that's been distributed to your OneNotes. And so you'll be able to see here, we've got the aim, super simple. You'll have a look at suggestions for how to control or minimize participant variables, and then suitable data handling and analysis techniques. Some of you spoke about a different independent groups experiment that was nothing to do with the one suggested, but you could still get marks for that, which I thought was interesting. Okay, that's it. We'll do plenty more of this in lessons.